All right, welcome to session 37 of Classic Metal Class. We've got Scott here who's going to talk about some of the technical aspects of things, particularly in certain magazines, because that is the theme that we're going to look at today is heavy metal and hard rock magazines. There's a bit of overlap in particularly the 1970s and 1980s, and maybe we'll get into the story of why a lot of these didn't do so well in the 1990s, which I think there were a number of different factors, not just the shift away from hair metal to grunge story that we hear, but paper costs went up, all sorts of other factors. And then, once we had the internet, market for magazines kind of went down, but they were incredibly important for people of our generation. And we have Ken here as well, who is going to give us a bit of a British perspective. I tapped his brain about this earlier, same generation essentially. And I think for a lot of younger people, this might be a bit of a surprise just how massively important these magazines were for this, whatever you want to call it, global subculture of heavy metal. They help to promote bands, they help to connect us in different ways. And we've looked at other media that played an important role. Like we did an episode on videos prior to MTV. It turned out there were an awful lot of them. I think if I remember right, we also did an episode about television shows, didn't we?
Yeah, we
And
talked.
they played an important role. And we've also touched on something that's, maybe worth a show in itself, which is tape swapping networks, where people would, and it wasn't just all informal, an older brother of a friend who's got a tape of this band that you got to hear and you dub it on your dual cassette tape or something like that. There were actually advertisements in some of the magazines that we're going to talk about way in the back for tape swapping networks, I guess we'd call them. Probably
Yeah.
totally illegal, but and as Ken has pointed out, there were some bands that actually profited by this. Iron Maiden was a great example. They weren't getting radio airplay, so they would actually encourage people to swap tapes because they knew it would lead eventually to selling more records and being on tour. So for teenage metalheads in the 1980s, like Scott and I, neither of us grew up in a major metal mecca like, New York City or Los Angeles or, basically any place in Great Britain for a certain amount of time. Magazines were really important in ways that I think maybe younger people wouldn't be aware of. And it was kind of a cool stroll down memory lane to look at all the covers and dig around in some of these magazines from the 80s, and you forget how important the role they played was until you actually see that these were really promoting people. And I mentioned Ken. I asked our often guest and contributor Ken about his own experience with metal magazines in Great Britain in the 70s and 80s, and he offered some very helpful information and excellent insights that we'll be drawing on. So I just want to give a shout out right at the start. So it was actually, let me start out with this. Scott, what was the first one that you remember getting and where did you get it?
Actually, I remember that. Circus magazine, and it was in a grocery store.
Okay.
And I want to say Quiet Riot was on the cover. I think it was a live shot of them, and my mom was shopping and I was bored looking at the magazines. And of course, in the stores there's extensive, especially back then, there was extensive magazines. But I was, at a young age, I was pretty sucked into the idea of rock and roll. Not just the sound of it, but it looked so cool. Like the cover looked so cool.
Yeah.
And I was flipping through it, and my mom actually agreed to get it for me. I thought it was one of those, I kind of put it in the cart. I found her and put it in the cart.
Surreptitiously.
Well, I think she thought, like, if I'm going to read it all, that's a good thing.
Sort of the justification that parents used to have sometimes with comic books. Well, at least it's a book.
At least it's a book. Yeah. And that was the first one. And I actually even remember it was the summertime. It was hot out because I was reading it in the car, and it was cool. It was very visual.
Yeah.
It had a cool impression. I mean, back then, the internet kind of got rid of the mystique, but you have to remember these people on the cover were wearing outfits you would never know where to find because they're all kind of custom made. The shoots were over the top, and they were almost like cartoon. I mean, they're almost like comic book characters. And the best we could do with the album covers and everything is kind of dream of what it was like, what they were doing, and you always picture them like Kiss put themselves in the mansion with,
yeah.
and
I was just thinking about like Kiss Alive and Kiss Alive 2, where they have all those concert shots, and we'd open them up
oh yeah,
and we just like stare at them, as kids.
And I think that's with the magazine that had that effect on me. It was like they were almost like superheroes, and all the stuff inside it. There wasn't, all the photos and everything inside the magazine was like drew me in. And then of course I wanted to. You heard they had hits on the Quiet Riot had hits on the radio already, so I knew what they sounded like. But like you had said at the opening, you would start to see bands and photos of cool bands that you've never heard of, being in the Midwest.
Yeah. I think that's another good point. If you grew up in a really big city, there would be a station that you could probably hear metal on more than just a little bit each day. Whereas, so growing up basically in the Milwaukee market, we had WQFM at the time. Later on, we got another channel, 103. And then we had like a classic rock channel, which would sometimes play harder stuff, right? It'd play some Led Zeppelin or they wouldn't play Black Sabbath. They'd play some Deep Purple, Scorpions, things like that. But there were bands that would just never make it on. Iron Maiden hardly ever got radio play, even once like Somewhere in Time came out in my area. And there were quite a few other bands that, like Wasp, they weren't going to get airplay, except for Restless Gypsy. That song made it on because it was romantic and stuff like that.
And that's where the Scorpions went right, by the way.
By getting on the radio?
Like Still Loving You was their big one, but Rock You Like a Hurricane and stuff, for some reason they made the crossover. They were on the radio.
They managed to do it even before that. Those Uli John Roth albums, there were some songs like Speedy's Coming that would get on the radio on some of these channels. So like in the 70s,
The 70s was a lot more open-minded. Like
okay.
you would hear 10-minute Yes songs on in the 70s.
Yeah. Now, Ken says something really interesting. Good point about the photos. People like Gene Simmons, Rob Halford, Tony Iommi, and Alice Cooper were instrumental in forming what became the metal look. Yeah, I
agree. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's something that you can say, I think the magazines really fostered it. Maybe arguably more than videos managed to do, because videos are coming out. MTV starts in 1981, and they're going for a while, and they were pretty influential, but the magazines were like a constant churn. And you might see a video and see something and be like, wow, that looks cool, and then you'd have to wait like a day to see it again. Whereas with the magazine, you just open it up.
And did you ever have a subscription to any of them?
I never did. I was a regular purchaser, first at Circus, right? And then Hit Parader. And I toyed with the idea of getting a subscription, but never got around to it. And then when I was later on playing bass, I would buy Bass Player as well. And you'd get some good metal things in there. But there was something about going to the newsstand. And, it would be grocery stores, or it would be, for us, especially drugstores. Drugstores all had a magazine stand. And I mean, there would be everything from, it wasn't just music. There would also be like the little part above where, they had like R-rated magazines that, you weren't supposed to touch or anything. Kids were always trying to read them. But, like cooking and martial arts and, popular mechanics, National Geographic, photography, people, all that crap would just be on like one giant stand. And so the music stuff would be in one area, and you'd go over there, and you could get other things too. I mean, it didn't all have to be metal stuff. My sister liked to get Tiger Beat, which I think featured some bands, but it was mostly like, good looking actors and stuff like that
Right.
for teenage girls. So yeah, there was like an entire ecosystem, I suppose you could say, right?
Yeah. 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 Plenty.
And there were a lot of other magazines that we're going to talk about, that we didn't have access to. And we're finding, they've been essentially preserved now on places like Internet Archive or various metal sites where people scanned in the front cover, sometimes the entire magazine.
Yeah.
And it's cool to look through those because, again, if you didn't live in like a big market, you might not have access to something that's coming here in the States, something that's coming from Britain. Like we didn't have Kerrang, which Ken has, explained was just massively influential. And we would hear like maybe rumors about stuff like that, but getting yourself a copy, you'd probably have to go down to like Chicago in my area. I don't know, growing up in Ohio, where would you go? Like Philly or not? That'd be kind of
Cleveland. I wasn't too far from
Cleveland.
Cleveland.
Yeah.
There was somewhat of a scene there, but it's certainly Cleveland wasn't a mecca. Cleveland wasn't. I mean, if you grew up, like I had a friend grow up in Los Angeles. He was born and raised, and when he was a teenager, he got to see some of these bands. Younger, so like
Yeah.
we can only dream about it looking at the magazine. And at best your friend had a band in school or something, but not being able to see any of it in real time, as opposed to if you're in a major city like Los Angeles or New York City, where you can see these people walking around all
Yeah.
dressed. Like Boston was that way in the 80s. People would walk around all dressed up, and Boston was a huge, a lot of bands came out of Boston in the 80s. But
I will say that the Milwaukee area was a little bit unusual that way. Not only did they have, the kind of dive bars that like smaller bands will play in, but they did have the Mecca arena, and a lot of bands played there, including Black Sabbath when they had that famous riot here in Milwaukee.
oh wow,
Where they were like throwing bottles at the band on stage. I forget who they were here with, but things didn't go well. But we also have this music festival, Summerfest, and it's been around for more than 50 years. I remember going as a kid. My dad was a fan of Paul Revere and the Raiders, so he would drive us all. It was like an hour to get to Summerfest at that time. And we'd be out there in the summer heat, and they'd be playing music, and it's down by the lake. But in the 1970s, hard rock was doing really great at Summerfest, and in the 80s there were a lot of metal bands that would play there. It's been kind of slim pickings for a number of years at Summerfest, so metal fans complain about it because the management now, it's mostly like pop and some country stuff and some R&B, and metal, actually punk don't get much representation, but every once in a while a band will come through. So like in recent years we've seen what we saw Queensryche, and they really rocked. Vixen, who in the 1980s were kind of a milk toast girl band, but now are actually a really solid outfit.
Yeah, they're great.
Yeah, I mean, with the addition of musicians who can really rock.
My friend Brittany's the guitarist.
Okay.
And I've known her for 20 years, but she's great. She's a great singer, so she really adds a lot to the harmonies and stuff.
Yeah, and they've got that Brazilian bassist who also sings too.
She's married to Richie Kotzen.
Oh, okay.
So yeah,
Yeah.
it runs in their household.
Yeah. So, you can see a good band on occasion there, but, like, I
Yeah,
I think this year, the only arguably metal bands they have are like, I think they have Def Leppard there headlining, but, I mean, it's, way past their prime.
yeah,
And they have Baby Metal and maybe one other arguably metal band, but that's it. Anyway, that's like a little rant on my
yeah.
part. But point is, like, in the Milwaukee area, you would get some of these bands coming through, but getting tickets was always a problem when you lived out in the sticks. It wasn't easy. People would buy them all up. You needed to go to like Sears to buy tickets
Sears,
or other
it's
places. Yeah,
true.
yeah.
I was gonna say Sears was like or some record stores
Mm,
had tickets.
right, right. Yeah. Yeah, I suppose what they must have done is they would buy up tickets in advance and then sell them at that store and maybe get like a little commission. So there
Ah,
were, so these magazines were a way of participating in things. It wasn't just like staying on top of the news. It was entering into the world of heavy metal. And so, what did a metal magazine have to offer? There'd be this front cover, and we'll talk about those a bit more. On the front cover would always have like a picture on it, and that picture would be a musician or a whole band, or on occasion it would be two bands like juxtaposed because they like to have this versus kind of format. And that would set the stage, and it would always be a very dramatic picture. So if it was Ozzy, he'd be making some weird face. It wouldn't be like him just sitting back smoking a cigarette. you know if it was Steve Harris, he'd be doing his like bass machine gun kind of thing, right?
yeah, that's a
Who was
classic.
Rob Halford? He'd have that metal gauntlet, or not gauntlet, bracer with the studs on it sticking out.
Yeah, yeah. Oh yeah,
And then,
exactly.
what I've looked at a lot of these recently, and what I remember of the covers is there'd almost always be like one big headliner, sort of like at a concert, right? And then you'd have like, here's an article on Ozzy, here's an article on Saxon, here's an article on, some more obscure band that you haven't heard of, but you're like, I wonder who that is, right? And it would, if there was any sort of contest going on, they would tell you about that on the front cover too, because I think that was a big draw for a lot of these magazines. And then there'd be articles, and there'd be like a table of contents. There'd also be like a list of who the writers were, so it was a proper magazine, and the articles would focus on a particular band usually, and they would sometimes incorporate interviews with them. There'd be stuff about the members and the songs, if they got a new album coming out, if they're on tour, what do they think about this? What do they think about that? Any controversies? I remember reading one in Circus where they were asking Rat, some people say that you're just an Aerosmith clone. Is there any truth to that? Because they did Walk of the Dog, and of course, Stephen Percy and I think Bobby Blotzer responded, no, that's not the case, because that was back in the time when people were like, Motley Crue, they're just a Kiss clone. Wasp, they're just an Alice Cooper clone. Um,
Yeah,
and then
and
oh, go ahead.
oh, I was gonna say that's a really good point because I remember those kind of like arguments going on, like people fighting, like for example, Poison. Oh, that's just they just stole everything from the New York Dolls, but it's like
Yeah.
no, they got it from Hanoi Rocks or but these bands that were always had to be derivative in some way. That was the put down, right?
That's it. Yeah, I think to use the word clone was essentially like a shorter way of saying you're just ripping off so and so, you're derivative of so and so. And I guess it was kind of low hanging fruit, right? Because all you have to do is say, this kind of looks like this, or this kind of sounds like this. So therefore, they must not just be influenced by, they're basically trying to rip them off. And I think there's some bands where you could say, okay, I think this has legs, like Kingdom Come,
Oh yeah,
are they a Led Zeppelin clone? Yeah, I think
yeah.
so.
That's the one that's the only one I usually agreed on, because even when I was younger, I was sensitive to like people like, the White Snake album, and it's like, oh, but that's just like the Zeppelin thing. I'm like, well, but the thing is, you've got David Coverdale in the band, who's a legend in himself. So I'm not
Yeah.
gonna, you've already got somebody that goes back to those times.
Whitesnake is a tougher sell, I think, too, because Led Zeppelin was always a four-piece outfit, right? So it's kind of what would you call it? A pared down
Yeah,
kind of band. Whereas Whitesnake, they'd have like 6 or 7 guys on stage.
two
They were a
guitars.
big band. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I mean, I could see drawing parallels between David Coverdale and Robert Plant by looks,
Right.
right,
Yeah.
and stage presence, but they don't sound alike at all.
And they came from the same era is the other thing that makes it a tough sell is,
Yeah, I
you
guess so. Yeah, yeah.
the Burn album was what, 74? Do I have that right? So like, we're talking Coverdale was like right around, I mean, and he
Yeah,
was in
that's
Deep Purple's around that era.
yeah, and he was on Stormbringer too, and,
Yep.
that last one with Tommy Bolin, "Come Taste the Band," was it?
Yeah, that's a great one. I love that album.
Yeah, and then, he formed the Whitesnake Project. So Deep Purple breaks up in '76, and I think Whitesnake was already putting out an album in '77, if I remember
Which
right.
was more bluesy. Like, when
Yeah,
he
oh,
comes,
yeah, yeah,
his blues thing. It wasn't until later when the '87 Whitesnake album came out that it was, it changed everything. You
yeah.
know, they kind of
So
had.
Andy says, going back to the cover photo image issues, when I worked at Walden Books in the early '90s, we
I
often
remember
had to put the paper covers on the metal magazines and have them up above eye level with the Erasure mags in the display stand. So that is funny to hear. I never saw that myself, but I guess yeah, maybe so. Walden Books, it's kind of a
Yeah.
vanilla-y kind of place, right? Maybe if they were at, places like Walmart in the South, which was Walmart wasn't penetrating the Midwest until like the '90s, really. Maybe they would have been behind covers. I mean, you could kind of get in trouble in some places getting out of Circus or Hit Parade or whatever
The-
else you could get your hands on. Like I remember teachers going around in study hall and confiscating those magazines from us because they were like, this is satanic or this is, too hedonistic. Look at these people. So
Well, and that's exactly what it is. Like what I said earlier, they looked like cartoon characters, or comic book characters. They just you couldn't
yeah,
find this anywhere. So it's kind of like, what is this? What are these people dressed as?
yeah.
Uh, and that's what we thought was so cool.
Yeah. Now, Ken points out another really interesting thing. Cover tapes or later CDs were huge when they were first introduced. So you would have, and there were actually some magazines that put out entire compilation albums or tapes. And so it would be, yeah, you're right. It's a way of like getting to hear what they're talking about. And again, in a way, I think about Kiss Alive, right? And what a game changer Alive and Alive 2 were not just for Kiss, but for us kids, because you're growing up out in the middle of nowhere, but you put the album on and you hear all of this like crowd noise and the banter that
Yes.
mostly Paul Stanley, but a little bit from Gene Simmons and Ace Frehley are engaging in, and then you're looking at these lots of pictures, and you're like, wow, that must be amazing to be there.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Live albums were I remember when my friends did this too. I don't know if it was just around, but when you made a tape from your record for the car or whatever, it was always live with an exclamation point.
Yeah, that's
Like,
true.
Blue Oyster Cult live. And it was the live albums were so cool.
Yeah. I mean, I think in a way that maybe is harder to appreciate now in the present. Although, it is tough for a lot of younger people to get to go to concerts, right? Because concerts have become so expensive. So I don't know, but you can watch videos of concerts in ways that we couldn't do back then. So
Well, not only the cassette, I wanted to put in, remember those floppy records that would be in the magazine that you would like tear out?
yeah,
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 those were cool. Like, they would say, "Oh, we're talking about this band and here's one of
they
their
were
songs."
usually like 45s, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah,
And
exactly.
they were I think they were pretty low quality. They certainly weren't like good vinyl that you would, safeguard or anything.
But yeah, it was a cool way to like actually hear what the band sounded like.
Yeah.
Uh,
They weren't as bad as like those Fisher Price plastic records that we all had as kids in the '70s where you could actually like see the grooves. It was so low
oh,
tech.
right.
You
Yeah,
know?
exactly.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit more about what else was in these. So I mentioned contests, and there were all these different contests that would often be on the front cover, and then there'd be like a little article about it. And one of the funny ones that I came across was from Blast in 1988. And it was win a phone call from Robin Crosby of Rat. Now, Rat was riding high at the time. And, you could just imagine him calling you up, being like, "Hey, dude, how you doing? I hope you love metal as much as I do." I mean, now we have Cameo that does kind of the same thing, and it could be very impersonal. But I mean, I saw one for like win Lita Ford's gear.
Oh,
Um,
yeah.
so there were quite a few of those things, as well. So you could win concert tickets. What else were in contests? Oh, all sorts of merch stuff, like get an exclusive T-shirt or poster. So, but you
Oh,
had to always do something to enter the contest.
you had to like become on a mailing list essentially.
Yeah, yeah.
That I always thought of those contests as ways to gather up like mailing lists, so like that you get the demographic for advertising.
Yeah, which was really important at the time. I mean, being able to target a given population, that could be very lucrative, especially if they've already bought one thing, they're willing to shell out money for stuff, right?
Yeah.
And we were kind of nuts back then about, buying t-shirts or other paraphernalia. So
Yeah. Oh, and I have to say, we talk about inflation stuff, or as the years go on, things get more expensive. I still say that even back then, I didn't think t-shirts were too expensive. Like
yeah,
like for the time. Now I think t-shirts are too expensive at a show. If you're looking at $60-$80 at a venue, or the ticket prices, I could see shows all summer or buy the magazines or all that stuff. It For somebody, a kid with a part-time job in school, could go see shows and buy the records and stuff. Um, it was it was more common for us to have different t-shirts or a drawer full of t-shirts because stuff was affordable.
that's right. Yeah, yeah. And maybe there it was less extractive. I mean, not towards the artists. I mean, artists were getting screwed over left and right in the
Right.
'70s and '80s, right?
Oh,
But
yeah.
that was mostly the record companies and management. But I think there was less like squeeze everything you can out of the fans um, back then.
Right.
You know,
That's a good point. Yeah.
yeah. So another thing that we mentioned a little bit, I mean, pictures were absolutely centrally important, and many of these magazines would have effectively a centerfold, right? Now, it wasn't a dirty centerfold. Nobody was getting naked, although some of them were pretty close. Like you look at the original Motley Crue guys, or Iron
Right.
Maiden. I don't think that in the early years of Bruce Dickinson being in there that he ever wore a shirt for very long,
That's
on
right.
stage because you got big hairy chest. You know? But so we'd have there'd be like a centerfold, and sometimes they'd be like, poster inside, and it might be even like higher quality, and you would take it out, and usually there'd be nothing important on the two back parts, right? So then you would put it on your wall, and it would be part of how you would decorate your place, or you'd put it inside your locker at school, and that would show that you were into, Ozzy or whoever, right? And then there'd be all sorts of other pictures throughout the magazine. So you wouldn't have an interview without like some picture of the person who's being interviewed, maybe multiple ones. And there'd be a lot of pictures of people playing on stage. So you could get a sense of what that's like as well. Or picture from, when they're in the tour bus, or, some of them were very elaborate and staged, but I think many of them were more impromptu,
which were still bigger than life. Cause the
Yeah.
tour bus, impromptu on a tour bus is still something we could only dream about,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I think that was for many of us, it's probably a function of how literate we were. I think maybe some of my friends didn't actually read the articles at all. They just looked at the pictures.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there were enough,
Yeah.
the band name, or, so and so, it would say in small print under the photo, or on the left is this, mid solo, so and so, mid solo.
Well, that was something too, is you would get these really cool poses. Like sometimes you'd see the band and they'd be, it's like the front on shot of them all together, lined up on stage or in some other place, goofing around. There's a lot of photos of like the three Motorhead guys just kind of like screwing around doing stuff. And then you'd get these dramatic pictures where like, a guy is like catching the guitar after he's thrown it in the air, right? Or the three, you'd have the two guitarists and the bassist all lined up, all playing at the same time. The singer with the microphone twirling around in the air,
The Scorpions were great at that. Like the worldwide live pictures, like,
oh yeah.
just crazy. But yeah, those are the kind of things where it's just kind of like you were even imagining like what was happening. Sometimes like what's the one I remember with the Scorpions is in one of the magazines, like the guitars in like up in the air, and Rudolph is like sliding on the floor, and I'm like, is he gonna catch the guitar? Like, what's going on here? Like,
yeah. Another thing too that it occurs to me is we'd get pictures sometimes of what the stage show would look like. So you would actually, like with Iron Maiden, you would see pictures of the Eddie up on stage.
yes,
And that was kind of important. Trying to think of anybody else who was, I mean, Megadeth had Vic Rattlehead. But I think the Eddie kind of took up a lot of that space, right?
Yeah. Yeah, Eddie was that was on like, what is the Somewhere in Time Eddie gonna look like, or what is the so and so, because every Eddie looked different for like the tours.
That's right, yeah, and it would, I mean, everywhere they were, unless I suppose they didn't have enough stage space, the Eddie would come out and like do his thing, and like Somewhere in Time, I think he was shooting stuff.
He was, yeah, I remember that.
Rapper.
And if you remember, the drum riser went up, and Eddie's head was under the drum riser.
Oh yeah.
His hands were out on the sides where each guitarist would go out and do the twin guitar thing to Hallowed Be Thy Name.
Yeah. So lots and lots of visual imagery that was, I mean, it's static, but it was very dynamic the way it was photographed.
Right.
And then, advertisements, we started talking about those. We are actually kind of BSing a little bit before we got started about some of the things that, we would consider getting, and these would usually be mostly in the back pages, but there'd be like occasional ads here and there. Some of them would be like a full page ad. Like I remember seeing a full page ad when Seventh Star came out, the new Black Sabbath album, which wasn't supposed to be a Black Sabbath album, but the record company made Tony Iommi do it. And you had like a very dramatic image of Iommi in the middle, and then these young guys he's got playing with him around him. And, it's like, look at it for, get it at your local record store. Right. So it was essentially promoting by the album. And they could be for all sorts of things, and this is the way that the magazines would actually make revenue. I don't think that subscriptions were enough for
No.
most of these magazines. And it was a really great way to target marketing. I mean, some of the things, so we're talking about, Ken was bringing up, the metal look, right? So a big part of the metal look was leather, and specifically leather things that you could wear, like, studded gloves, or the bracers with the spikes, or, various other things. Hats were really big. And there were stores that kind of catered to that. In our area, it was Spencer's Gifts.
Spencer, yeah, that's us
Yeah,
saying.
and they also had great posters too.
The posters were the best, yeah.
But they also catered to the hippy dippy, let's get high on pot crowd as well. And I think, the early goths and stuff like that. So it was kind of scattered. With this, I mean, if you want to sell studded metal bracers, there's probably no better place that you can try to advertise them than in metal magazines, because who the hell else is going to buy that stuff?
That's right. Yeah.
Conan reenactors. I suppose the Dragon magazine might have been okay, for D&D nerds.
Sure.
But you're still going to get a better return on investment with doing it with that. And, there were I recall there being a lot of advertisements for albums, bands, and entire album companies and their stock that wouldn't be necessarily featured in interviews or articles because they were a little bit lower tier. But I remember, we're talking about seeing Black Flag. That's the first place I ever heard of them, or the band Bitch from LA, with Betsy, the dominatrix, running it. I remember seeing that in the back of a circus magazine, and I actually never sent away for those things. I didn't have the spare money to do it, but I think that was, there were probably a lot of people buying those things, right?
Yeah, I imagine. Although, it's even when I moved to Massachusetts, I was in a suburb of Massachusetts. The magazines were all that we had because we didn't have MTV we didn't have cable. So when I went to other towns, people would have those things. That the other towns that had the more of the access, people were dressed up more like the times. In my town, everybody was a hippie because we didn't have access to things, so it's kind of interesting. I'm like you. I didn't have the extra money to send away for the stuff, but it wasn't a thing in the town I was in. But in surrounding towns, I saw people with these accessories. Wow, where'd you get that?
Yeah.
Where would you get those? Spencer was that was the one and only place I remember.
Yeah. Well, we also had like a leather store. And I was actually trying to recall the old jingle from it because it was on the TV all the time. I don't remember. It was something in leather go together. They're almost one and the same. And they would have some cool leather stuff in there, but it wasn't oriented towards the heavy metal crowd, Ken says this also applies the marketing stuff to merchandise. If you lived out in the middle of nowhere, knowing who to write to in order to buy merch was really important. That's right. There were a lot of advertisements for T-shirts now that I remember as well.
Yeah.
Right. So, the only other alternatives would be finding a clothing store that carried that sort of stuff, which might be here something like Spencer's, or going to a concert, and then there'd be merch to buy. But yeah, now I do want to give one shout out to something that wound up being important for me, and actually my sister, and probably a lot of other people that did advertise in these metal magazines. And this is like a whole other can of worms, the Columbia Record Club. I don't know if they started doing it in the 70s, but certainly by the 80s, they were in full swing. They would send you, at first it was records, and then it was tapes, and then, CDs. They had this shtick where they would give you like 9 or 12 things for a penny. You would send them in a penny, and they would send you the first installation of stuff. And then every month, this is how they'd make their money. They would like ship you a record, and they'd be like, now, if you don't want this, you got to send it back. And most people were like, it's a pain in the ass to do that. And they would charge you above market prices for that. So like a record
Right.
back then might have been $5.99 or $7.99 in the store, and they would charge you like $11.99 plus shipping for it,
Plus
right?
shipping. Yeah.
And a lot of times what you would do is kids would do this, and then their parents would start, getting these bills, and they'd be like, well, this is bullshit. I'm writing a letter. It's going to say you didn't have any right to contract with my kid. They're a juvenile, better lay off. And then they'd let you go, right?
Yeah.
So for us kids, it was a great racket. And I knew some people who did it 5-6 times with different names. You get your 12 albums, and that's how I got a lot of my early metal collection. I remember getting Twisted Sister's Stay Hungry, Black Sabbath's Born Again, Judas Priest's Defenders of the Faith, Sammy Hagar's VOA, Crocus is the Blitz, and probably like 5 other albums that I don't recall offhand. Oh, Motley Crue, Shout at the Devil. I got through that as well.
That's a
In
good score.
the summer of 1984, I sent away to the Columbia Record Club. And then, and Ozzy Osbourne's Bark at the Moon. And my sister did that later on that summer and got another 12 records. And so that was a pretty, I mean, you would not just find it, of course, in metal magazines, but the advertisements in metal magazines, they would have like different lists of bands. So they'd be pitching the metal stuff to the metal fans. If you were going to get like a pop magazine, it'd be all pop stuff,
I want to say the best part of that racket I did in college, because every year the dorm was different. So they couldn't chase you. So I'd have like essentially a PO box, and then somebody else would have it the next semester or whatever.
Yeah.
Next year. So there's no way for them to track me down. So I did that myself, but it was more in college I did that. But it wasn't, well, I guess it was less of a racket than it was me just being lazy, like getting the 12 CDs and then keeping them and then not doing anything.
Yeah. Well, so the last thing before we get into some of the history of this, we should talk about like what we did with these. So you would get a magazine yourself, but then typically if you had friends that were into metal or even family members, you would share them around, and you might actually like sit together. It could be like a communal thing. I mentioned study hall. Somebody'd be like, hey man, I got the latest hit parader. Let's see what's in it. Right. And you'd open it up and everybody'd be kind of like jockeying for place. And they'd be like, oh man, they look cool. What about that article there? Let me read that. Who's in the middle of it? And it was a way, I would say, for us to not just share information and have things in common, but to feel like a sense of excitement and community. You felt like you were part of something bigger than just your little group of friends.
I really found it a bonding thing, because heavy metal wasn't big in my school, again, because everybody was a deadhead and we had no access to cable. But I remember being in homeroom once with maybe it was a circus, and somebody in my homeroom class seeing me with it and saying, hey, can I see that? And then all of a sudden we were talking about Shout at the Devil, and it was like his favorite record. And that ended up, that led up to us actually hanging out and listening to heavy metal albums. So for me, it was kind of like, because in past we've discussed here the type of person that became the metalhead, that was like really kind of swept into that world, essentially, right? It wasn't background dance music. It wasn't pop music at the back of a party. It was, you would go in your room and you would like escape into this world. And when you met like people, it was pretty fascinating. It led to a lot of discussion. And that magazine, for me in my school, drew out the people that were secretly metalheads or usually the kind of person that I was, which was more of the loner, the I was happier with my records than I was kind of at a party thing. So
Yeah, I mean, I will say this, there was also kind of a communal aspect to it, and I think it's particularly associated with, like, what somebody would be playing on their car stereo, or if they had, like, a boom box or something, and so, like, you'd be going somewhere and I don't know, somebody would have a boom box and they were dressed, in casual clothes, and then they'd be playing Ozzy Osbourne or Metallica or Iron Maiden, and you'd be like, oh wow, this is one of my people, we've
exactly.
got something that we can connect with. And you could make kind of inside jokes. You could make references that they would get. You could even just like walk over and be like, "Oh man, I love this band," or the cool stuff or things like that. And you would have a basis for connection, you could say, you know.
And
So,
the magazines gave us, oh, didn't mean to interrupt, but the magazines
oh,
um gave us a conversation piece, right? So
right.
it's,
Yeah, yeah.
oh, I saw Jakey Lee, and I'm a Jakey Lee fan, and you know what he said in this, and then you start discussing what was in the magazines because
Yeah,
you
it's
had
sort of like sports fans being, back in
right,
the day around the water cooler. Did you catch the game last night? They didn't do that well. I think they should fire so and so, right?
yeah,
It's all bullshit, but it's topical bullshit that people can share. And there's actually a word for that in linguistics. They call that the phatic, PHATIC function of language, which is basically just like bringing people together. It's not really about anything. It's
huh,
just like, sharing and being connected, but you can only do it with somebody who actually understands what you're talking about. So if you try to if you start talking about Ace Frehley and his latest album with people that all they're really into is Magic the Gathering, their eyes are gonna glaze over and they're gonna be like, you're a different kind of nerd and not our kind of nerd.
right.
Oh, it's interesting. We had an experience recently where we were at I want to say Sam's Club and getting some stuff, and so they have the super cheap, like, pizza and hot dogs and stuff like that,
Yeah,
so we grabbed some super cheap lunch. And I want to say I was wearing a Saxon shirt, and a guy came over to us and he was wearing some shirt too, but it was a newer band. And he was like, "Oh man, yeah, they rock." And I was like, "Yeah, they do." And we got to see him in concert, and we start talking back and forth. This is just a random stranger, and he starts talking about Milwaukee Metal Fest, which at then it was like to be anticipated. Now it's already, I think, over, or maybe it's happening this week. And it's happening at a place that has terrible acoustics, so no way we'd go and check that out, because we've been there before, and it's a terrible concert venue. But and it's all bands that we're not particularly interested in, but he's super interested and he's talking. And I want to say the conversation probably went on for a good, like, 7-10 minutes, and then finally he sort of came to himself. Yeah, Andy says he did not stop talking. Um and he sort of came to himself and he's like, "Oh, I'll let you folks get back to your lunch." But it's a sign of, like, the responsiveness that's possible with these kinds of artifacts, that they're involved with a shared world of meaning that resonates with people on a deep emotional level.
and I think that's especially true with metal, as we've always pointed out. You know,
Oh, Andy says he actually lost his kids and had to go find them, so he might have kept talking.
oh, so what? I was talking about Saxon.
Yeah, exactly. I think we did talk about, like, seeing them in concert, and how great Biff Byford is, even though he's like I think he's around 70 or so, but he still has the pipes and all of that. And some people, you could say stuff like that to them and they don't have any reference points. It doesn't mean anything to them, you know.
Right, right,
Like,
right.
when people talk about cars, I know what their shapes are. I don't actually know, like, the difference between one sports car and another. And people can talk to me about that and I can nod and be like, yeah, yeah, that sounds really cool. But it's not hitting.
I'm the same way. I don't know much about cars. I just drive them.
Yeah. Well, we want to get into some history, and I do want to point out two things though before we do that. So we're going to talk about a number of different, like specifically devoted metal magazines, but there's a subclass of magazines that Scott will talk more about how this worked because he read a lot more of these, but they played an important role in that ecosystem. And that would be, I guess you could call them professional musicians magazines, like Guitar Player or Bass Player or some of these other ones, because they would, they'd be profiling important musicians. Like Eddie Van Halen would get into Guitar Player, or Lemmy would get into Bass Player because they want to know what's your gear, what's your setup, and all of that. And they'd also give you tablature, which was nice, certainly for me. And the tablature would also have the lyrics, which was pretty important because sometimes you couldn't figure out what these people were saying. I'll mention too that Hit Parader actually did have a section devoted to song lyrics, which was very useful because if there weren't album notes, sometimes you didn't know what the band was actually trying to say in their songs. But so yeah, I mean, so besides Guitar Player and Bass Player, what were some of the other important magazines in that kind of niche?
There was one called Musician Magazine. I don't know if you remember
Okay.
that at all.
And that was more broad,
It was,
basically?
yeah, it was a little more broad. Although they would have different kinds of stuff, and there wasn't the Guitar Magazine was. It seemed, especially in the '80s, the Guitar Player, Guitar for the Practicing Musician, Guitar World.
Oh,
Um,
right. Yeah.
there's a lot of different ones, and I had a subscription to Guitar for the Practicing Musician, and that always came with a poster. All of them came with a poster. They came with 5 songs, tablature, meaning it would tell you where to put your fingers to play the songs. So if you wanted to play the songs, you were able to do that, and it was always kind of exciting to see what 5 songs they were, and everybody would play
Yeah.
them. Everybody
Yeah.
playing the riff to a certain song. And you would also, I mean, a lot of those turned out to be wrong, but we tried to learn them off the record. And then like when it came in the mail, it was
Yeah.
like, okay, we get it right. Oh no, it's this. But you know, I know for me, at least, I really paid attention to the metal players in it. Like Jakey Lee would be in an issue,
Yeah.
or they tribute to Randy Rhoads, and they'd interview his mom Dolores, and but there was a lot of advertising in those. But I think before we started earlier, when you and I were talking, before we started today, we were kind of talking about. You had mentioned that it was much more focused. It wasn't kind of like just a casual, well, not, I wouldn't want to say casual fan. It's not just a fan that doesn't play music. You really, people that bought it, the demographic were musicians.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it was a lot more technical. It was a lot more technical about, and they would have these columns called like Guitar Secrets, where, you know, like Warren DeMartini would say, here's a great warm up that I do before concerts.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
and that really brought the community around, because a lot of the players, a lot of the like guitar for that era was very much heavy metal. Like that was the popular thing. I mean, yeah, it did articles on blues players, and
Yeah.
it exposed me to R&B players, and I would know their names from that magazine. But essentially it was focused in on uh the more rock and metal stuff. And but yeah, like the Guitar Secrets, they had all these great things where you would essentially get to take a small lesson from your favorite guitarist. And they had the
Yeah.
Spotlight column, which had like guitarists from anywhere could send in their tape and get featured. I was actually in the 1990 version of Guitar for the Practicing Musician. I still have some copies. Queensryche was on the cover, and I'm in that issue. It was called the resume column, but Spotlight in Guitar Player, if you remember. I don't know if you remember, if you've ever saw that. They had a Spotlight column, they would take 3 players. So it was a wealth of knowledge. Like, you really got your money's worth.
Yeah.
But
Well, when I started playing bass, and so that would have been about like 1989, 90, I started buying Bass Player magazine. And it was great because like I remember reading a thing. Mr. Big had become like a
That's
super
right.
group at that time, and they had Billy Sheenan, and he was talking about how he played with, usually a bassist will play with these two fingers if they're not using a pick, but he developed a three-finger technique where you also use your ring finger, which is tough to do because you got to build up your muscles, and it's,
Yeah.
it requires a certain kind of mental coordination that I think maybe some people aren't up to, especially if they do a lot of drugs. That's probably not good, or drink a lot, and but it was cool because I'd never even like thought of doing that. And he's talking about, yeah, I came up with this idea. Here's how you do it. And I was like, well, I should try doing that. That looks like a pretty cool idea. And then I found it was very helpful for playing Iron Maiden style, Steve Harris triplets, right? The galloping bass thing. He doesn't use three fingers, but you could use that technique to do that. And so making those sorts of connections with technique can be quite helpful. And you mentioned the tablature. Um, so I was playing with these other guys in the army, and they'd all like they'd played drums and played guitar before. I just happened to pick up a bass that was like laying around in the rec center, and essentially taught myself how to play. And one of the like first 5 songs that I learned was actually Rush's Tom Sawyer.
Cool.
And, that's not an easy song, but nobody had told me that it was too difficult for me. So I just kind of tried it, but there was tablature for it. And I was like, okay, so this is what you do. Okay, let's play this 5 measures now. Okay, that's that, riff, I guess you'd say, or line. Now let's do the next one. And I learned how to play it. So
Uh, Another thing
if it
about those
wasn't for
oh,
if it
go
wasn't
ahead.
for tablature, I would have never figured that song out.
Yeah, I mean, that we relied on that back then. But one of the cool things, I don't know if Bass Player had it, but the guitar magazines had something called In the Listening Room. And they would take somebody, for example, like Yngwie Malmsteen. Like every month was a different player, and they would play them 6 different songs on their entirety. They wouldn't tell them what it was.
Okay.
So sometimes the guitarist would know exactly who it was. Sometimes they wouldn't, but they would comment on what they heard. And so, like, they had Vi in the listening room, and it was fascinating because pre-internet, you have to understand, you didn't know what these people thought. Like,
Right. Right.
I wonder if Paul Gilbert likes Eric Clapton. Besides speaking of their influences, but they would play them off the wall stuff. And I think I remember the Yngwie one because it was a little too brutally honest. Um, he put down
Undiplomatic.
he put down Steve Vai. Although the one that surprised me is they had him back probably uh, in the 90s, and they played him something from Dream Theater's Images and Words.
Okay.
And Yngwie goes, I have this album. And actually, Yngwie is a big Dream Theater fan. He's like, this is a great guitar player. This is like, and I like reading that was shocking, you
Yeah.
know. But I think that's an important thing that that was another conversation piece. But there was no other place besides those magazines that you would, oh gosh, what are they going to, what are they going to make Vi or Satriani listen to, and what do they think of Jeff Beck when they hear him, or do they even care about Eric Clapton? And that's where they would go on about, well, this album was a big inspiration to me, and I would have never guessed. It was just kind
Yeah.
of like,
Yeah.
so that was a big thing. The opinions of the artists.
Yeah, and that's a good segue back into like talking about these magazines generally, because I think you would get some of that in the better articles. I mean, some of these articles were by people who had many years in the music reporting business. They knew what kind of questions to ask. Others were just like, some guy who happened to have wandered into a job, getting to like sit in the backstage with Motley Crue and bullshit with them and get some answers or something, right? Um, and I do want to point out before we start going into the history of this, there's a lot of magazines we're not going to talk about because there was like an entire, so we're going to talk about like the first and second tier magazines, but there were all these fanzines, and some of the magazines originally started as fanzines and then, migrated their way on up, you could say. And some of the fanzines, you can find them online, are pretty good. They're not as beautiful, right? There's
Right.
no like professional photographer getting pictures of these things, and some of them are just black and white, and some of them are actually just drawn. But the articles can be quite good, you know. And you didn't always have to be where the musician was. You could like call them up on the phone and do an interview if you were stuck in Finland. It's harder to get access to people, but yeah, there's an entire host of those out there. And it was a time when zines are kind of coming back again, I would say, but they, they the internet probably did a number on them, right? Because to make a zine is labor intensive.
Right.
And then distribution and circulation is difficult. So let's talk about some history. It's surprising how old some of these magazines actually are. There were several major magazines devoted to hard and heavy rock going back to the 1960s. And we've mentioned Hit Parader already. So Hit Parader starts in 1942. And by the 1960s, they're covering rock groups. And it's an American magazine. Actually, it went out to like GIs during World War II. In the 1970s, they start to cover some heavy and hard rock bands. So you start seeing people on the covers. And then, interestingly, and this is kind of a story that we'll see in some of these other magazines, they're captivated by some of the other music movements. So punk often gets, looked at, but also new wave. New wave was massive in the late 70s and early 80s. And they were they were losing circulation. They weren't doing that well. And so they shift in their editorial staff in 1979 and 1980, and they became the magazine that we knew, without all this backstory, that was particularly interested in heavy metal, especially the new wave of British heavy metal, and then the LA West Coast scene. Those were probably the most photogenic and
Yeah.
easy to interview groups. So, they became like a major force, again, and then they kind of wane once we get into the 90s. New Musical Express started in 1952. They were kind of marginal. They focused mostly on rock and pop. They were interested in upcoming new music, and there were some like discussions of metal bands in the 70s, but by the 80s, not doing too much. And then we get Circus, who we've mentioned already as well. And they weren't even called Circus when they were started. They were called Hullabaloo in 1966. And I mean, that's a pretty, decent hippie name, I think,
Yes.
right? And they changed their name to Circus in '69. And they had a spin-off called Circus Raves in the '70s. By the early '80s, and I think this is a common theme for a lot of these older magazines. They're like, this is where the interest is. This is what the young people are listening to. We're going to be about heavy metal. And so again, we thought of Circus as like, oh, this is definitely a metal magazine. And by then it was, but it didn't start out that way. And I would say that by the time that like we were in the middle of our teenage years, Circus was, losing some of its what would you call it? Not reputation. They were really focusing more on glam than on the heavier acts. So there was kind of a bifurcation taking place. Hit Parader seemed to be more like middle of the road. And then there were all these other magazines that were like, well, if you're a real metalhead, not into that like, light
Right.
metal stuff, that Circus is doing, here's what you need to be checking out. Rolling Stone, would occasionally have stuff about metal bands.
Right.
Not super engaged with the metalhead subculture. I think they kind of look down on it a bit. they would feature artists like Van Halen. He'd make
Right.
a cover. Eddie Van Halen would make the cover, but they weren't that big on it. But then Cream. Now we would sometimes see not articles. We would see issues of Cream, but you had to like drive into Milwaukee to get that.
Oh, really?
Yeah, you couldn't find it in Waukesha or the local drugstores. It was more of a big city kind of thing. And they had an interesting sort of um, ethos. So they're from Detroit. Detroit, there's some important bands that came from Detroit. It does get part of the metal legendarium with Detroit Rock City and stuff like that. But it's kind of in the middle of nowhere, so to speak, right? Um, it's not near either coast. It's certainly
Right.
not anywhere near Britain. And so this one starts in 69 and they focused on all sorts of heavy stuff. So heavy metal, punk rock, new wave, alternative bands. They gave a lot of airplay to bands that were based in Detroit, like Alice Cooper, the MC5, the Stooges, and Iggy Pop, Parliament Funkadelic. And they were kind of ahead of the trends in important respects. So they're some of the first people to really be pushing Motorhead and Judas Priest and Van Halen. So we didn't, like I said, we didn't have easy access to it, but they were important behind the scene. Sounds, which Ken has talked about quite a bit, British music newspaper that started in 71 as a weekly paper, originally about progressive rock. And they were supposed to compete with New Musical Express and Melody Maker, but they start covering punk, and eventually they start getting interested in metal as well. And that's going to give rise to one of the most important bands that we'll talk about in just a moment as we get into the early 80s. But then there's also a Japanese magazine we should mention called Young Guitar Magazine. And so I guess this is sort of straddling the, musical, actually have some talent. I need to know how to play guitar. And then
Right.
the broader picture. So it focuses originally on folk, and then they start covering hard rock in the 70s, and by the 80s they're featuring guitar virtuosos from heavy metal and progressive rock. They really liked Van Halen's debut album, and they took that as a sign that was like things changing, and this is where things are headed to. So we didn't have access to that at all, but it was important for that part of the world. And then we get in the early 80s, we get Kerrang. And again, that was something that you could get here in the States, but not so much where we lived. We'd hear about it,
Yeah.
occasionally. And I think I remember seeing somebody who had copies of it in school, but it wasn't readily available unless you like lived on the East Coast or West Coast or maybe in Chicago or someplace like that. Did you ever see copies of it where you
No, I
were?
heard about it, but I never saw a copy of it. I don't know. I don't even know how I heard about it. I mean, I just recognize it, but I've never seen an issue of it.
Yeah. So that was a spin-off from Sounds, and it was this heavy metal special edited by Jeff Barton, and it was very popular. So, they saw an opportunity for making money, having influence, and they took it, and it became just a massively important British magazine that was, I guess you could say, it was kind of a tastemaker in ways. And it was devoted to the new wave of British heavy metal early on, although there were of course features on older metal acts, particularly as they were reconfiguring themselves, like say Black Sabbath. But eventually they're going to shift away. And Ken has talked about this in the past, that maybe it was a watershed moment when Kerrang quit being quite so interested in the new wave of British heavy metal and became more interested in like thrash and glam and sort of going in a more American hit parader circus kind of direction, right? So that's an important part of the landscape. There were a couple other British magazines that were important. Metal Mania starts in 82. Metal Forces was really quite interesting. 83, they get started. So, this is like the heyday of the 80s. And what was cool about them is that they covered bands who didn't yet have a record contract. So they would break bands, so to speak, not in a bad sense, but like putting them
Right.
forward and saying you got to listen to these people. So for example, Megadeth, Metallica, Slayer, Overkill. So we see some thrash bands getting brought over. Death, Poison, all of these were talked about before they got record deals. Ken had mentioned, albums that might come with a magazine. So they actually released a compilation vinyl album called Demolition Scream Your Brains Out in 1988. Demolition was their feature where they would talk about a band that you got to hear these guys even though they don't have a
Right.
record yet, And so
Yeah,
I think that's a really cool feature,
that is. Yeah. I mean, that's one of the other strategies with that was, I don't know if you ever had it. We had a Tower Records in Boston, and I remember with any purchase you got a free 45 of Accept. It was the Metal Heart album.
Okay.
And it came out. It came with a 45, and so
Yeah.
whatever you bought, you could buy John Denver record. You got the Accept.
That'd be like 1985 too. So like,
Yeah, that was
height of their popularity. Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, I think that was important.
Do you remember what the songs were? Because there must have been one on each side, right?
You know what? I think it was Metal Heart and Screaming for a Love Bite was the B side, which I listened to more often.
Okay.
But that's what got me into Accept.
Interesting.
Yeah, so that was a marketing thing that I listened to it so much I ended up buying the album because I thought it was really cool. Like,
how I first heard them. I want to say that it was through the Metal Killers collection, which was an amazing compilation album. And that's how I got introduced to a lot of bands like Tank, for example, that Run Like Hell was on there. There were a couple stinkers
yeah,
on the tape. And it was a long one too. It was like 45 minutes on each side, I want to say. But they had Accepts Fast as a Shark on there. And then I think I got Balls to the Wall after that, and then went back to getting Restless and Wild, and then finding other stuff before that. But yeah, that was really quite good. So
yeah,
anyway, back to these other things. So there's some other magazines that get started in the early 80s. Faces Rocks, which is not exclusively metal. That's in 83. They also do some new wave and hard rock. There were two interesting French magazines that get started. Enfer, which means hell, in 1983. Lots of bands, lots of articles from all over the place. I haven't looked inside, but the covers look pretty amazing. And then there was Hard Rock Magazine, also in French, started in 1984, mostly focused on heavy metal. And what was kind of cool is they didn't just focus on American and British and German bands, which were dominating, I'd say, at the time, but also some French bands like Sortilège and some of the other less known bands. And I will say that I think, and we've talked about this before, English as a common language for lyrics and stuff like that. French bands that didn't sing in English kind of screwed themselves as far as
right.
like larger distribution. And it looks like, French and Spanish bands were particularly prone to that. Now, Ken points out, oh yeah, Metal for Mothers, another compilation album, very useful intro to many bands that for me were far less well known. Yeah. And actually that's one that we saw advertised in the magazines, right? You could send away and get a copy of it.
Right. I mean, like, I love that one. Yeah, the Away. That's the only thing I did buy. was once in a while I would buy a tape.
Okay.
You know, you send away, and you know what's weird is the trust we had in sending away. You know, as
Oh
a
yeah.
kid, cash.
Well, not just for that, like comic books had those things where you could like send away for X-ray specs or like a
Right.
a buzzer for your hand or the army men or sea monkeys. And you'd put like you write like a little check or money order and you'd send it, and like in 4 to 6 weeks, something had come to your place.
I know. Literally, yeah. That's just the money order bit, the trust, and I never got ripped off. You know, so like I
Yeah.
was eventually got something.
Yeah. Yeah, it's quite amazing. I mean, the whole level of trust in so many things, I mean, parents letting us stay out without knowing where the hell we were, just being like, just be back home at 6 o'clock,
Right.
for dinner, and
That's right. Yeah. Exactly.
sometimes they
Yeah.
seem downright disinterested in where we'd been.
Looking back, yeah.
Yeah. Well, so we've gotten up to like 1983, 84. There were some other magazines that were becoming big in 83 and then onward that were really quite important for like a worldwide community. So there's Rock Hard from Germany, and they offered additional language editions. So they would write the magazine in German, and then they would translate it into French for France, Spain. There was a Portuguese one for Brazil and Portugal, Italy, Greece, Slovenia. By the end, and they were considered to be a really important magazine in Germany. They got called the Central Organ of Heavy Metal Fandom. So that would, I guess, be like the equivalent of the Circus or Hit Parader, except that they're publishing in other languages. And Metal Hammer does that too. Metal Hammer is a British magazine that starts in 83. And eventually they've got their own, um, you know, foreign language versions in Japan, Spain, the Netherlands, Italy, Poland, Hungary, France, Israel, Serbia. So I think that's an important part of the network that we just didn't have any insight into, because
Yeah.
if we got Metal Hammer, it would be in English, right? And it would be from some newsstand in a city that we managed to get to. And then there were a lot of other cool national magazines. So Burn in Japan, with a exclamation point and several different R's in it. They're started in 84, and they become the major Japanese publication on heavy metal. They actually have two extras: Burn Japan, which was devoted more to Japanese bands, and Metallion. There was Heavy Heaven in Finland, which I think is kind of a cool name. Um, and we've talked about Nordic metal. They featured a lot of American and British bands, but they also featured some of the Nordic bands that we talked about a couple episodes back. In Canada, they had Metallion, which starts in 1984, and it's black and white at first, and then they switch to color, which is what you see in a few of these other bands, or magazines. One of the things that I thought was kind of cool about that, and we're going to do an episode on Canadian metal later. So one of the things I think a lot of people don't know is that the Canadian broadcasting setup requires radio stations to play a certain proportion of Canadian artists. So they've already got like a built-in market a bit, and something kind of similar, not legally, but in terms of content, is happening with Metallion, because the first issue features a whole bunch of other bands, and then it's got articles on Anvil and Helix, right? And a Lee Aaron centerfold. So, the metal queen from Canada, whose stuff really isn't that metal. I will say it's more hard rock, but she was managing to capitalize. The second issue included Exciter, another Canadian band, and then the third, Triumph, right? So it's kind of cool to see them supporting the
Yeah.
local industry. And then there was an Argentinian magazine started in '84 just called Metal. And at first they were taking interviews from foreign magazines, and then eventually they get their own people to do, you know, interviews. They get correspondence. They do telephone interviews. So you know that you're seeing a worldwide metal magazine network setting up. And one of the other things I'll mention is that there's also some like moving from one magazine to the other. So, you know, Kurt Loder, who I think a lot of people remember from MTV, was, if I remember right, he was with several different magazines, including Circus at one point. So there's some significant talent that, you know, and people don't always get along. So sometimes they're like, screw you, I'm going to start my own magazine. Well,
Right.
that works out great for the metal community, right? And not only do you have talent in editing and interviewing and writing, but the photographers, a lot of these people are professionals who start to be able to earn a real living going around and taking pictures of metal concerts and things. Wow. Andy says, can't believe Kurt Loder is now 80 years old. He was quite a bit older than a lot of the bands and musicians he interviewed at the time. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. He's 80. Wow. Because I remember the MTV News, right? That was
Yeah.
him.
But he was probably, so I mean, MTV is coming out, you know, more than 40 years ago.
Yeah.
He would have been in his 40s
40s.
then, right? And
Yeah.
he kind of looked like it, but he just
Yeah.
seemed like a cool guy, you know?
He did. He was very calm, very, matter of fact. He was perfect for that.
Yeah. So when he was interviewing artists like, say, Nirvana and Alice in Chains in the '90s, he must have been in his 50s.
Yeah. That's right.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, so then in the '80s, now once metal has really caught on, now people realize there's money to be made with that, right? So some of the stuff is quite cynical, some of it is probably much less so, and let's just say enthusiastic and exuberant. They're like, hey, these guys can do it, we can do it. So we get a magazine called Powerline that starts in '85. And originally it's just published in the New York tri-state area. So New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. But by 1988, they've got national distribution and they're around. And I remember seeing Powerline by the time that I was like in finished with high school and in college. And interestingly, their first issue, they took a French band that we've mentioned already, Sortilege, as the people that they wanted to focus on. There was also Metal Edge, and I remember seeing that around as well. They focused on glam and traditional heavy metal. There was another really cool one out there that I guess was very influential in European circles, and it was a fanzine from Denmark called Blackthorn. They started in 1985. They were probably the most successful fanzine that remained a fanzine rather than turning into a proper magazine. And then we get these interesting German magazines. There's Crash that starts in 1985, and one called Horror Infernal that starts in '86. And they start out black and white, and they switch to color. A lot of American bands getting featured or interviewed in there. Another very interesting one was RIP, which I think I remember seeing that as well. I never read it. And what's unique about them was that they were the first non-pornographic magazine that Larry Flint Productions put out. So Larry Flint, I think if people don't know who that is, he's the guy who started Hustler magazine, and it spun off into a whole bunch of other pornographic magazines. And he's the main subject of the People versus Larry Flint, the Woody Harrelson starred in years and years ago. So I think that basically they saw that this is popular. There's money to be made. They probably had some people that were interested in heavy metal. So they started a heavy metal magazine, and it did pretty good. Their first issue featured a story on Guns N' Roses titled Metal's New Supergroup, in 1987. Kind of fits, kind of makes sense from an LA perspective. There was also Blast and Metal Rendezvous, Metal Maniacs, and these tended to be more focused on, at least with Metal Rendezvous and Metal Maniacs, they tended to be a little bit more focused on extreme metal. And then there was another one called Power Metal Magazine, and they billed themselves as the nastiest magazine on earth. Now that's a lot to live up to, right?
Yeah.
And they were a spin-off of Hit Parader. And the idea was that, so Hit Parader was like still focused on essentially, glam and traditional heavy metal. They saw that thrash and death and black metal were becoming really big, and they were like, we got to cash in on this. And so they featured a lot of bands. But there's a really funny article out there where somebody's pointing out that like the features and the advertisements did not match at all, right? They were drawing on the same sort of stuff that would make it into Hit Parader. And so they're advertising all these like kind of glammy bands like Dangerous Toys, right? So you're reading an article about like, the latest, black metal or death metal, and then they're trying to pitch to you that you should buy, on a one-page advertisement, you should buy this album by this band. They even had some that weren't even metal but just hard rock.
Right. Yeah.
So you probably lose a little credibility doing that,
but also they're paying the bills with the ads too, so
only if the advertisers pay you, right? But the advertisements are only effective if they actually work. So if you're pitching it to the wrong audience, people are like, I'm not going to listen to those posers,
Well, that's it. I mean, that was a very real phrase.
Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly. We're not going to listen to those posers. Interesting. Yeah. You got to choose your demographic.
Yeah. So then there was another one from Britain called Raw, and the back history of that one's kind of funny. So they start in 88, and by that time Kerrang had already shifted into, more of an American focus, and Raw emerges as kind of a rival to Kerrang. And so then this sort of conglomerate, EMAP Publications, they try to buy Kerrang, and it doesn't work. So then they buy Raw, and they're like, we've got plenty of money we can throw at you. You're going to be a rival to Kerrang now. And then what ends up happening is they're able to acquire Kerrang after all. So now you got the two metal magazines both being owned, well, a couple other metal magazines too, but being owned by the same, conglomerate. And they just sort of like let things slide when it comes to Raw, because Kerrang is viewed as the better product. And so, they become, what would you say, a casualty of mergers and stuff like that. And then, Ken says, I'd forgotten about Raw. I don't remember that magazine really landing with my friends and I, which explains the Kerrang buyout. Yeah. And that buyout stuff happened in like 89 and 90, I think. Which is, kind of at the end of our era. There's one other magazine that we should mention, Hot Metal from Australia, that started in 1989. Australia has always had trouble getting bands to come, to Australia. And so like the video stuff was very important before MTV. They were kind of leaders in that, and getting features about stuff was important as heavy metal became important. Interestingly, we've talked about this quite a bit before. Is AC/DC a heavy metal band? Hot Metal was convinced they were.
Well, yeah, right. that's always the one. AC/DC makes the jean jacket, but it's a rock and roll band.
Yeah. Well, and I remember I want to say it was like 1985, and it was on the cover of Circus, and it was AC/DC, and the title was "We Are Not a Heavy Metal Band," and they were, because they were worried that, I guess, people were going to confuse them with heavy metal, and somehow it would be bad for them, because Kiss was perfectly willing to use the word heavy metal to sell more records, but for AC/DC, I guess they thought maybe it wasn't so great.
Right. Yeah. We are not heavy. Yeah. Well, I've seen that in interviews.
Yeah.
Well, it's funny. That's a question I think that they get asked.
Are you really metal?
Are you a heavy metal band? Or people call you heavy metal, how do you respond?
I mean, some bands, it's pretty straightforward. You're Iron Maiden, yeah, you're a heavy metal band. Nobody's going to confuse that.
I mean, I think AC/DC constantly gets asked that.
Yeah.
I don't think even that statement made people, people still probably call them heavy metal, or it's brought up.
Certainly the parents and teachers who are concerned about and demonizing heavy metal thought of AC/DC as being a heavy metal band, right? But they also thought of like UFO as being a heavy metal band too, and maybe they're kind of yes and no. Yeah.
I mean, AC/DC is, form wise, and if you break down the chord progressions and the actual feel, and even the way they run the guitar sound, it's all rock and roll. I think maybe the vocals confuse people because it's more of a screaming kind of vocal than a
with Brian Johnson, right? I mean, Bon Scott wasn't doing that. It's interesting too, because there have been some things circulating around of what Brian Johnson sounded like with Geordie, and when he was doing like commercials on TV, and he doesn't sound like the Brian Johnson of AC/DC that much.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Wow, that's interesting. Oh, there's that one with Brian Johnson and Mark Knopfler from Dire Straits, reminiscing over singing songs they remember from their childhood.
Oh, really?
And it's on YouTube. If you put if you put both their names, it's like they spend a day hanging out, and they have their kind of their own language as far as But do you remember this one? And of course, I remember. Yeah. They start singing like it's basically like old Scottish tunes and all that kind of stuff. So, but it was interesting. It was really interesting to see that side of him. So I didn't know about the jingles and the commercials and stuff.
So Ken says AC/DC were not a metal band in the same way that Lemmy insists that Motorhead were just a rock band. Right. I don't know about that. I mean, I think that AC/DC is probably further out. Motorhead, I want to say it's sort of like Albert Camus saying he's not an existentialist, right? Now, if you understand who he means by that, it makes sense. But we still teach him in existentialism classes, and it's because he fits. He's got a lot of the same sort of themes. And I think you could say, like, there's this great thing that Pandora was relying on for a while called the Musical Genome Project that claimed that they isolated out like 870 different characteristics of songs that allowed them to make associations and say, where something fit. And I mean, I would say that Motorhead, yeah, of course, heavy metal is a branch of rock, and it includes a lot of stuff, but Motorhead has more in common with, say, Deep Purple and Black Sabbath and Rainbow and Judas Priest than they do with Bad Company and stuff that's more straightforward rock or AOR, right? So I think they fit, even if Lemmy wants to say that they're not heavy metal. I mean, sir, we talked about this with in another episode with bands that say that they're not heavy metal, like Van Halen. I think they called themselves big rock for a while. They said, well, no, we're not heavy metal, but everyone else is like, no, no, man, you're heavy metal, because we
Yeah,
think you are. I mean, at a certain point, the musical similarities and then what the fans think. I mean, AC/DC would have to say that going back to them because people were like, no, man, I'm going to the AC/DC concert. Heavy metal rules.
right. Well, Van Halen appeals to a lot of the rock and roll people, like people that don't like metal, like Van Halen.
Well, I would say that's true more for Van Hagar than for original Van Halen.
Well, especially Eddie's playing, like people that
Yeah.
are rock and roll or more roots rock players like Eddie, but they
Okay.
wouldn't like George Lynch.
Oh, okay. Yeah, yeah. I see what you're saying. Yeah.
Because Eddie's got strong roots from like Clapton and that kind of stuff. But
Yeah.
Van Halen was always an interesting one because I think they could fit in different categories.
Yeah. I'm cool with categories not being exclusive, right?
Right.
So to say that somebody is a heavy metal band doesn't mean that they can't be classified in any other way. And I think there's quite a few bands where particularly like in early years, like in the 70s, we can say, well, some of the stuff on this album is heavy metal and then some of it's something else. Like think about Uriah Heep, for example. Gypsy is heavy metal.
Mhm.
Sweet Lorraine, that is not a heavy metal song. UFO's got quite a few things like that too, where you're like, okay, I'm willing to say Doctor is heavy metal, or
Okay. Yep.
Lights Out.
Lights Out.
Um,
Yeah.
this song over here, no, this is just hard rock.
Yeah.
Andrew says, "Oh, one of the things I noticed about Kerrang back issues is that each time its readership aged out, the magazine pivoted, embracing grunge in the early '90s, new metal around 2000, emo post-hardcore in the mid 2000s, and metalcore. It's funny to me that metal authenticity is always negotiated with the demographic, yeah. Or how a magazine may say we don't follow trends is itself a trend. Yeah, I think it became tougher too. As a magazine, I think Andrew's right because we saw this too with like Hit Parader and Circus. Grunge. They pivoted to that too. Um, and yeah, when you start changing the direction, the ethos of your magazine to fit a certain demographic, you're losing your other demographic, who I guess you're saying, well, they're probably not going to read us. We got to focus on where the kids are today. But
Right.
you do that a couple times, and what do you have left? You know?
Well, yeah. I mean, there's the thing about there's two sides. There's we're for the unsung heroes,
The
or we're
cutting
for the
edge,
trend,
yeah, yeah.
right? Yeah, we're for or we're for what's popular right now. Um,
Ooh, check out. So Ken says that was actually adopted as an advertising feature by their competitors. I distinctly remember Metal Hammer advertising themselves as being real metal when Kerrang pivoted to grunge. Yeah, I mean, so it opens up a vulnerability, right?
got it. Yeah. Uh huh.
That's interesting. What were you saying though? You had a thought that I think maybe wasn't quite finished.
Oh, I don't remember. I don't. I was talking about um um going with trends versus. I mean,
Oh,
can
right, yeah.
it's like, are you going to go with what's popular so you sell the magazines, or are you going to be kind of like a? I mean, for us, from us metalheads, it was underground in the sense that it related to our geekism, our the fact that we were nerds and we were into what, and at least in my case, what other people in my school weren't into.
Yeah, I think too, we were really keen to hear about stuff that was gonna be good, right? And whether it was popular or not, which I think mattered to a lot of people like they, I want to go see this band because they're in the top 40, they've got some hits, or like I actually remember my mom's boyfriend, who was a PR guy. He had some concert tickets. This is back in like the 90s, and he's like, "You want some free concert tickets?" And I was like, "I don't like that band." And he's like, "Yeah, but they've sold millions of records and people love to see them." And I was like, "I don't give a shit. I'm not into them. Why would I go to a concert to hear somebody whose music I don't like?" And his eyes, you could tell he just didn't get it. It was like, if it's popular, it must be good.
Right.
But I think for metalheads, it was more like, I want to hear something that's going to move me, where I feel like I'm connected to it. And it doesn't matter. Obviously I'd like to see the bands that I care about doing well, making money, filling stadiums. But if it's just them coming to, the local dive bar, I'm happy to see them there too. As a matter of fact, that might even be better because I can get closer to the stage. I think there wasn't that worry about who's popular and who isn't.
Right. There's a distinction there, definitely, between, are we going to go for what's hot right now? And then that came up because we were talking about pivoting.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, it's interesting because you can look at some of the fashion of some of the bands, and some of it was pivoting in weird ways that you're like, what the hell are these people doing? Like, you look at the costumes that they put Ozzy's band in for the Ultimate Sin tour. I mean, Bark at the Moon was already starting to push in that direction. But the Ultimate Sin, you're like, this is really weird stuff. I mean, are these like women's suits that they're putting Ozzy in? And what's Jakey Lee wearing?
and I have a question for everyone. I remember when Ultimate Sin came out, and then I don't know if you had the VHS, which had like the Ultimate Sin video and stuff, and then a live show. Well, when that came out, my friends and I watched it, and we were shocked at the time. What was that, 86? 86? Yeah. We were going, what the hell are they wearing? You know, so it wasn't like a trendy thing that we were buying. It was like, wait, this is the Prince of Darkness. This is, and he looked like a grandmother, to us. And
I think, with like, and this will probably be rather controversial, but I really liked Motley Crue with Shout at the Devil. I did not like Theater of Pain. And part of what like cemented that for me, because at first it was a musical thing, and I was like, what's this Home Sweet Home bullshit,
That's what
but you saw the pictures of them in the metal magazines, and you're like, how did you go from like everybody wearing black leather with studs on it, and to this, like, you're wearing fedoras and like blues guys stuff. This is weird. What's with you? And of course, all the girls liked it, so they became much more popular at the time. And it was hard to, debate that, right? But I always felt like, this is when they started to suck, and when they wanted to become better, they became more tough guys, more hard,
That's right.
That sort of stuff. Ken says, I always thought that the weird costumes reflected Ozzy's drugs and mental health struggles. So like Ozzy's high as a kite and walking around and like, I'll take that, man. And they're like, excuse me, sir, that's women's garments. No, that's good. I think from what Jakey Lee said, Sharon also played a role in it as well. It was her kind of fashion choices, and she just came and said, you're wearing this, you're wearing this, you're wearing this.
This is what the kids want.
Yeah. Can you imagine that? I mean, at least with like, say, Iron Maiden or something, you'd look in the picture when they showed up on stage, they look basically the same as what you'd expected from seeing them in Hit Parader,
That's true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Spandex, some shirts, that was basically it.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. And they were consistent through all that era, even somewhere in time. I mean, I think the only difference is Dave Murray had feathered hair, but that was That was
Yeah.
about it.
Yeah. Whereas Judas Priest, they stuck with the leather, but Turbo, it became colorful,
Yes.
in a different way. Actually, that's a little bit of a segue into something I did want to get to before we finish up and run out of time. So, we mentioned different articles, and one of the things that I thought was particularly funny about these magazines, and I guess I bought into it at the time when it was happening because I was young and stupid. But they would have these juxtaposition articles where they were basically trying to suggest or create a beef. And sometimes a beef
Yes.
did exist. So one of the really famous ones that was done a couple times, Iron Maiden versus Judas Priest, right? And it makes sense to compare them because they're both in the early 80s. Um, Big bands that could draw huge things. They actually toured together. At one point, I guess Paul Di'Anno was kind of a jerk and almost screwed things up for them. But by, like, say, 83, they're sort of equal in stature. They've both got the same configuration. One awesome singer, a bassist who's a main songwriter, although I will say Steve Harris is a better bassist than Ian Hill, and I think Ian Hill would say that as well. Two really great guitarists, a a drummer of some sort,
Yeah.
and so it made sense to compare them. Um, Metallica versus Megadeth was another later one. Perfect. It makes perfect sense to compare them because they're, both four pieces, thrash. Mustaine was in Metallica before he got kicked out. He creates Megadeth in part to, like, screw over Metallica. So there's a beef there, right? Wasp versus Striper. Now you're starting to reach, right?
Yeah.
So why Striper? Because Striper is the LA Christian band who's very theatrical. And then you got Wasp. And they've never confirmed this, but, like, one of the legends was that Wasp stood for We Are Satan's People. So you could, the
Yes.
Satans versus the Christians, but they did a lot of that kind of stuff. Like, Rat versus Dokken, which one is better, or Rat
Right.
versus Motley Crue, and most of these bands didn't really have any sort of beef with each other, but they would try to make it out like, there's this big rivalry here and we should care about it. And I guess it was just to promote drama.
Yeah. Oh, exactly. And then, that it got people almost feeling like taking sides,
Yeah, there you go.
or actually I do like Rat better, where it wouldn't occur to them there was a rivalry before. But I mean, I definitely remember the Maiden Priest one.
Yeah. Well, I think that one got done a couple times. That's part of why we remember it.
The Mustaine one, the one with Megadeth. I mean, that's a perfect one because it's like, I'm going to be heavier. I'm going to, it was kind of,
yeah.
I mean, Mustaine kind of made it a beef a little bit, but I think it was taken
very
to
publicly too.
Yeah, very publicly. I think, and I think that they jumped on it and said, wait, are you the real stuff like Metallica or the real stuff like Megadeth? Which is the true metal band?
Yeah.
So that's a classic rivalry. I think that's the big one. But they did make them, a lot. I remember, I don't know if that comes from the Beatles or the Stones. Like initially it was like, are you into the Beatles or are you into the Stones? And it was like unheard of. You could say both.
Yeah. I read something recently, and I don't have the source for it. I think I read it in Quora, and it was somebody who was quoting Mick Jagger, and they were he was asked, like, do you guys have a big rivalry with the Beatles? And his answer was no, because we were always number two and we knew it. So, like, he remembers going to a Beatles concert in America and, like, kind of coming in the back and, like, hoping nobody would recognize him to bother him. And he's like, I didn't even have to worry about that because everybody's attention was totally transfixed on the stage. and I listened to them play, and I observed the fact that they had 4 lead singers, whereas we had 1. And I was like, oh man, we're going to really have to work our ass off as number 2, and we're probably never going to be where these guys are.
That's interesting.
Yeah. And I thought that was very smart on his part, rather than being, I mean, if it was Paul Di'Anno, he would have been like, these Beatles suck, man. They're no good. Or
What's
with
his name?
Quiet Riot, Kevin DuBrow,
Right.
right?
He was the biggest trash talker.
Yeah, he's the poster boy for that sort of thing. I mean, he was bitter in his case about the other LA bands because he felt that Quiet Riot had done a lot of the groundwork and not been properly
Right.
thanked or compensated. But I got to tell you, I've heard those first 2 Quiet Riot albums, and they're not good,
Right.
So
I know. I mean, I think his claim to fame was Randy Rhoads.
yeah, I think so.
He became such a legend. Well, wait, he was in my band first,
Yeah. Were there any other kinds of articles that you thought were particularly noteworthy to bring up as we're finishing up? I mean, there were always, one of the templates was the comeback after, drugs and alcohol. I mean, Ozzy did these all the time, right? I'm finally getting, sober, man. We're going to have like a great time on stage and all that. But it was sort of like the dramatic thing of like, you'd either have like the new group and they're the hot thing in town, or there's been Black Sabbath, did this a couple times, collapse and then rising from the ashes like a phoenix. I think that was kind of a common article,
Yeah, well, Don Dokken put that album up from the ashes when he did his solo album.
Right, yeah.
So, well, actually, that's the kind of reboot thing. That's an interesting one. When a band passes their time, how they're gonna come. And you know what? I would say, a lot of them. I'm trying to think. Well, I mean, if you look at even Turbo, but there's a lot of bands that changed with the times that didn't need to change with the times. People liked them because they were them, and it's not like, well, if we follow this new trend, then the new kids will like us. Well, the kids are never going to jump to an old band because they're acting like their favorite bands. Ken says the perennial reunion tour rumor.
Oh
article.
yeah, there you go. Yeah.
And you know who in metal who and it turned out to be a sad ending, but that was the John Sykes thing, because he kept promising an album. You're going to see an album really soon within the next few months, and years would go by, and then nobody would hear from him, and then somebody would get like an exclusive interview. No, I got a whole new band going. I have a whole, and none of that stuff happened. He was the Winery Dogs. John Sykes was in, and then Richie Kotzen replaced him, and I don't know why. We were never told, but I think, I mean, that turned out he died of cancer, but like but they got viewership like that metal show. What's his name was saying, I have the exclusive to John Sykes, Eddie Trunk. It's the exclusive to this new news, and then the disappointment of it not ending up happening.
Yeah.
Oh,
here's an interesting thing. So Andrew says, when I think about my time reading Metal Hammer, NME, Kerrang, etc., I think now that every metal scene claims to champion openness, yet every scene survives by drawing lines. I'll try to put that better. Subcultures advertise openness, but they have to police boundaries to stay recognizable. Their very survival depends on the lines they draw. Yeah, I think that's completely right.
Yeah.
You can't let anybody in, because then you don't really have a distinct ethos. And so you can also say this happens both like at particular moments in time, but also through time as well, right? So if a band starts to become too experimental, and it's no longer solidly within the subculture that you associate them with, you're like, well, what do we do with these guys? They don't play any of their old stuff. They're just playing this new weird stuff now,
Right.
I mean, there was that scene in Spinal Tap where they were kind of caricaturing that. What were they doing? Fusion bass or something?
It was the jazz blues odyssey.
There you go. Yeah. I mean, people do that sort of thing, and it could be how you change the way you look, how you dress. Um, and there's certain things where you get diminishing returns. You think about the glam look in the 80s, right? How high could you actually
Yeah,
poof your hair? There was a certain like threshold beyond which you couldn't get it any higher or teased out any further, right?
right.
How people were doing this with like dropping the tunings. Okay, you can drop it a couple notes, and at a certain point, it's just floppy strings, and you can't
Right,
play a damn thing, right? Yeah, I mean,
right.
you can like on bass, you could add an extra low string right below the E string. What was it, like a B string, I think?
Yep.
Um,
And
but now,
guitars do that with 7 and 8 strings,
yeah, yeah. But at a certain point, it gets gimmicky. It's no longer within. It's almost like a subculture needs to have like a core, and then it can have a periphery, and it's the periphery where a lot of the policing is going on. Because in the core, you belong, right?
Right, right. I think what's interesting about, you add a 7th and 8th string to a guitar. But a lot of the bands I've heard just use it for like chugga 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 chugga, like really low. Although you've expanded the range of the guitar, there's so much more you could do with it, and some people do. But it kind of was like became that competition for a while of how low can we get the guitar.
That's right. Yeah.
You're well into the bass range now. What's the point? you know,
Yeah. Well, and then they had a bass to like, sit
yeah,
with them as well. And you're like, I mean, this might be just for elephants, people who have
right,
subsonic hearing or something. Um, I mean, I
right.
guess we could say we had similar things like how high can you sing.
Jim Gillette, right? What was the band Nitro?
I don't know. I mean,
They were all about how high Jim Gillette can sing, and what was his Michelangelo, how fast he could play. He was supposed to be like the fastest guitar player. So
right. Yeah.
they're the
Yeah.
but they had the hair up to here. I mean, they were like ultimately glammed out, but they were like, I could, I have the most vocal range, and this is the
You know,
fastest.
it's interesting if you think about just that like singing high thing, right? So there are some singers who have incredible vocal range. Rob Halford, Jeff Tate,
Yep.
where it's many, many octaves, and they can hit the high notes, and they're not doing falsetto when they're hitting the high notes.
Well, right.
But they're not singing high most of the time. They're usually within the middle range. And then you have like artists like King Diamond, where it is falsetto, but it's a strong falsetto,
Yeah.
and it fits the music, and it's done up there a lot, but it's done expertly. It's not a gimmick. It's how they do it, right? Some one trick wonder coming along and being like, I can go 3 notes higher than King Diamond. Well, who
Right.
gives a shit, right?
I know.
You got to
Right.
have a good song, or else it kind of doesn't matter.
Yeah, and that happened with the flashy guitarists of the '80s. They would get signed because they were flashy, but there was no song, so you never heard
Yeah,
from.
yeah.
They were cool for a minute, but then you can listen to Ingve, who has those first albums are great, and there's songs associated with it, and it's not just you can't just ride on the technique.
That's right. Yeah. So
You know,
Andrew has another interesting point. Growing up, one of the big insults for a fan, yeah, I remember this, was being told your favorite band sold out. I remember being told this about Alkaline Trio, a pop punk band from Chicago. I was ready to end the guy. Yeah, yeah. I mean, that was like metalheads would get into tiffs about stuff, right? I remember getting Judas Priest Sin After Sin on tape on a trip down to Florida for spring break, along with Black Sabbath's "We Sold Our Soul for Rock and Roll." Coming back up to Wisconsin, going to my high school, and having my boombox because I carried it around with me everywhere, and playing it, and then this older guy saying, "Oh man, you had to pick the one Judas Priest album that sucked."
What?
And I was like ready to deck the guy too, because I was like, this is great stuff. We get very passionate about these kinds of stuff. Now, in that case, it was early Judas Priest versus like the contemporary Judas Priest of 1983, 84, Screaming for Vengeance and Defenders of the Faith and some of the albums that had just happened before that, like British Steel, right?
Right.
But yeah, I mean, the notion that like we established something with quality, and it could be like they didn't really have their crap together back then, or they've sold out, they've quit making the good stuff, now they're just like trying to be popular, or they jumped onto a fad that they shouldn't have, which is what Iron Maiden got accused of in Somewhere in Time and Judas Priest with Turbo. And it turns out, I mean, Somewhere in Time, the whole album stands up.
Yeah.
Turbo, okay, you put that up against Screaming for Vengeance and Defenders of the Faith, and it's definitely a different album. But some of
Yeah.
those songs, like Out in the Cold, Turbo Lover,
Yeah.
um, have really stood the test of time. Others, like Parental Guidance, maybe
Yeah.
not so much.
Oh God. Well, it's funny you say that. Like, we keep going back to this theme of metalheads being um a certain breed as far as being very extremely passionate and
Yeah.
loving the music so much. And it just goes back to the Aristotle thing of, belittle something you care about, right?
Oh yeah. To make
So
angry. Right. Yeah.
that's, I think that we get that way when it's like you're being sold out, and when it's kind of when we have this level of passion for the music. It's not like, oh, I like this album, it's a fun album to dance to. Well, you probably wouldn't get angry, but I think, when you're talking about metalheads that get extremely kind of passionate about this stuff, it completely makes sense that we get so angry. And my friend Dave and I always make fun of each other, like, oh, your favorite song is Parental Guidance. You don't even like the other stuff, and that's the way we kind of rattle each other's cage, where that really wouldn't happen to a casual pop listener that may like a song, right? Where,
They wouldn't even have the frame of reference to figure out why it's an insult,
well,
right?
that's it. Yeah,
Yeah.
the amount that you care about something or someone is what really gets you angry about it.
Yeah, Ken says, this is true. We do get super passionate. Easy way to wind up a metalhead. Yeah, and it's interesting too, as we're aging, like some of us, I'll admit I certainly struggled with a lot of anger problems. Philosophy has helped with that. So, I shouldn't be as much of a hothead as I was in my teens and 20s, but yeah, I can still get riled up about some of this stuff, you
Oh
know.
yeah.
And I think there's a lot of people our age who probably still can, but it's also, so we got to bring this to a close. So I'm going to throw an interesting tidbit idea out there. Plato in the Republic talks about us as having like this rational part, and then this, desirous or appetitive part. And then there's this middle part that he calls thumos. And that's the part that we get angry with. But it's also, it's often translated as the spirited part or the passionate part or the incandescent part. And it's not just where anger is as an emotion is located. It's also where like the desire for rivalry is, and it's what makes people good fighters. Also like good for braving danger and other things, being good EMTs or firefighters or things like that. And I think that kind of joy that comes out of listening to this kind of music, maybe that's very thumatic. Maybe there's something about that. Maybe we need to do an episode talking about that down the line. That might be kind of interesting to
That sounds
bring up
really.
psychologies and heavy metal. But I think that maybe that's a good part of it. And so coming back to the magazines, this is a place for us to sort of anchor that to some degree, to get information, to share meaning, camaraderie, all of those sorts of things.
Yeah.
But I'll leave you to have the last word, Scott, before we finish up.
Well, another great topic that you came up with, and digging into it leading up to today, and discussing it, it really brought forward how important these magazines turned out to be, for what reasons. especially me having the memories, like the one where the kid saw me with the magazine and we became friends and started listening to metal together, and
Yeah.
he knew whatever album, and I'd go over his house to hear it. So I think, there's a lot of pre-internet stuff that's very useful to discuss, and this is certainly one of them. So I really enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah. Well, thanks to everybody for joining us and the great comments. And we'll probably pick up with some of these topics down the line that we've thrown out there. So
Yeah, absolutely.